Hello and welcome to the Accessibility in Gaming podcast, the podcast about the accessibility, successes, and setbacks of all things gaming. I'm your host, Shelby Farley, also known as the Blind Gamer. In this week's episode, we will be talking about the tabletop game that you probably played as a child or may still play today, and that is Sorry. The game Sorry, which is created by Hasbro, is a game that I have played for as long as I can remember. Even as a very young child, when we would have family game nights, this is one of the games that we frequently pulled out of the game closet, and we had and still have a ton of games. And yet this is one of the games that we tended to gravitate towards because it was just a lot of fun and it's pretty easy to learn how to play. To play the game, you have 4 pieces that are all the same color that you have to move from the start position in your corner, around the board, back to your corner, and then through the safe zone and into your home position. To do this, you flip over cards that have various numbers on them, and you either move forward that many spaces, move backwards 4 spaces, or send someone back to their start position, or switch places with another player. So for example, if you flip over the card and it's a 3, then that means that you move forward one of your pieces 3 spaces. However, if you flip over the card and it's a 4, that means you have to move backwards 4 spaces, which in some cases can be a disadvantage because you could be fairly close to getting home and then have to move backwards 4 and then you're further away again. But in other cases, it can be an advantage because, for example, if you're on the first space right outside your starting position, then moving backwards 4 puts you right outside the safety zone, which the safety zone, basically, whenever you're in that area, people can't send you back to start, and if you get a backwards 4, then that doesn't apply to you because you're in the safe zone. So like I said, if you're right outside your starting position and you have to move backwards 4, then that puts you right next to the safe zone, which means that you're super close to getting home without having to go all the way around the board. Another card that you may flip over is an 11, which basically means that you can either move forward 11 spaces or you can swap one of your pieces with one of the pieces of another player. That way, if you are farther behind where they are, then you can switch places with them, which puts you closer to home and also puts them potentially further away from home. If you flip over a 7, then that allows you to either move forward 7 or you can split that 7 between 2 pieces. The other card that you can potentially get is a Sorry card, which basically means that when you flip over that card, you can take one of the pieces that you have that is still in your starting space and put it where another person's piece is and send that person's piece back to their starting position. There are also slides, and basically with slides, if you land exactly on the beginning of that slide, then you slide down it and basically get to move forward several spaces without counting those towards how many spaces you are allowed to move based on your card. It's really not that hard. I'm not great at explaining things, but the game itself is pretty self-explanatory. And on each card, there are instructions on how you can use that card. So for example, with the backwards 4, it'll let you know that it's a backwards 4 and not just moving forward 4 spaces. But now that I've rambled and probably confused you a whole lot on how to play the game, let's get into some of the things accessibility-wise that the game does well. The biggest pro, accessibility-wise, to this game that I can think of is that the numbers on the cards are very large. I have very poor vision, and so it's hard for me to read print unless it's extremely large, or I have some kind of magnifier. But with the numbers on the cards in Sorry, I can read those no problem without having to use a magnifier. I don't know exactly what point font they use for the numbers on the cards, but they take up a good percentage of each of the cards. Unfortunately, while the numbers on the cards are extremely large, which is amazing for someone with low vision, if someone is completely blind, doesn't matter how large the numbers are, they still can't see them. So it would be very important to have Braille numbers on each card so that someone with little to no vision can distinguish what card they have drawn tactily. Another thing that the game does really well is that the start and home positions are really large, which makes them easier to see, even across the board. The start and home positions are basically large circles, and you put all of your pieces at once in the start position, and when you get pieces home, they all fit inside of the home circle. So, since it has to be large enough to fit all 4 of your pieces, that automatically means that the circles have to be fairly large, which is helpful for me and probably other people who are visually impaired, because it's a bigger target compared to most of the stuff on the board, and it's easier to not only know where your home and start positions are, but also know where other people's home and start positions are. A disadvantage, though, is that while they are large and easier for some people that are visually impaired to be able to see, for others that have even less vision or are completely blind, it doesn't matter how large the home and start positions are because they can't see. So they wouldn't be able to find exactly where they are independently. One way that this could be remedied is by putting raised lines around each of the circles for start and home. So that way, if someone is playing and they can't see well enough or at all, then they can feel where their home and start areas are, and if need be, where other people's start and home sections are. Along with that, something else that would be helpful is having Braille labels on each of the start and home areas, because even if there are raised lines around them, all of the start and home positions would feel the same. They would just feel like large circles. So the Braille labels would allow someone to know, okay, this is the start position and not the home position, and vice versa. So I feel like those two things would really need to be done together and not just have one or the other. Something else that could be improved about the game is that the text explanations on each card are very small. While I have been playing this game for as long as I can remember, and therefore know what each of the cards do, whenever I first started out, I would have to have someone that's sighted read to me what each of the cards said to do, because unless I used magnification, there was no way for me to read what the cards said. So I would imagine that for someone that has vision that's just as bad as mine or worse, or someone that doesn't have vision at all, they would struggle with this as well, which also means that a group of 4 blind or visually impaired people couldn't really play together without sighted assistance unless at least one of the people knew how to play the game and knew what each card meant without having to read the explanations. A way to remedy this would be to have a cheat sheet with large print and Braille explanations of what each card does, because there's a lot of printed text on the cards as is, and if you make the text larger, or at least large enough for most people with visual impairments to read, and then also add Braille, which takes up a lot of space, the cards would be massive in order to fit everything on them. So a cheat sheet would probably work better because then you could put the entire explanation for each card on there without having to worry about how much space you're taking up with each explanation. Or, of course, something else that I mention all the time in this podcast would be an electronic version of the cheat sheet. This would allow people to use their screen readers, such as JAWS, or TalkBack, or VoiceOver, or whatever software they are using on whatever device they are using, to have the information about each card read out loud to them. This would also allow people that are visually impaired to zoom in or zoom out to make the font as large as they need it to be, rather than having the font at a set point, which still may not be large enough for someone to read. However, if an electronic version was created, I would also recommend having some way to jump between each card explanation, such as table of content with a list of all of the cards that you can click on to jump straight to the explanation. That way the individual isn't having to scroll and try to find that specific card that they are looking for. Continuing on to another issue with accessibility of the game Sorry is that the spaces are too small. With the exception of the start and home areas, which are very large, like I mentioned before, the spaces that you must navigate through to move around the board and also in the safe zone are extremely small. So whenever I played as a child, and even now, if I play the game, I can see a few of the squares in front of me if I get super close, but I can't see the squares that are across the board unless I basically stand up and lean all the way over the board to figure out where I need to move to, where my piece is, where other people's pieces are, things like that. So usually what I end up doing is I move my piece as far as I can without having to stand up and lean over everything and invade everyone's personal space, and then have someone else move the piece the rest of the way, because I just can't see the spaces, and so it is really hard for me to navigate the board. And of course, for someone that is completely blind, or say only has light perception, or whatever the case may be, there's not really a way to independently navigate the board even right in front of you, because there's no tactile markers or indicators of where one square stops and the other square begins. So a couple options for the spaces would be to make the lines that indicate each space much bolder. While I still wouldn't be able to see across the board, it would still help me navigate the squares that are closer to me without having to get as close to the board, because they are more distinguishable. Another potentially helpful option for people with some vision is to make the squares larger. There's advantages and disadvantages to this. One advantage is that the spaces are bigger, which means they're bigger targets and therefore easier to find. The disadvantage of this is the board would need to be larger, and therefore the spaces that are across the board would be even further away. They would be larger though, so it would still probably be easier than the way things are now, but it's not as great of a solution as some of the things that I'm going to mention here in just a second, such as creating tactile lines separating one square from another. This would be a great solution, at least it would be for me, and probably for other people that are blind or visually impaired, because then I could just feel rather than having to hover over the board and, as I say with many things, sniff the board, because I have to get so close that my nose is touching the board. So I could just feel where each space is and move my piece around the board tactily, and would also allow the player to move their piece all the way around the board without having to rely on assistance, because we could just feel where the spaces are, even if we couldn't see them, and move our pieces that way. Another issue is that it's easy to knock over the game pieces. This is something that I dealt with all the time when I played this game frequently, because when I did stand up to try to move my piece, I would end up knocking over other pieces in the process, trying to figure out where my pieces were. And even if I wasn't trying to stand up and move my piece that way, just trying to find my piece, my hand would end up bumping into other pieces and knock them over. And we would have to try to figure out exactly where the pieces originally were before I knocked them over. This is something that myself and other blind and visually impaired friends that I have deal with in many different games on many different occasions. And this game is no different. So a fantastic solution for this would be adding Velcro to each square on the board and to the bottom of each game piece. This would also help with the previous issue about the spaces being small and completely inaccessible to someone that has no vision. Because not only would having Velcro make it much harder to knock over the pieces because they would be stuck to the board and therefore wouldn't move as easily, but it would also be another way to tell where the squares are, because you could just feel each Velcro spot on the board and find each space that way, rather than relying either on what little vision you do have or on sighted assistance. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 special because it takes care of both of those issues. The last issue that I want to address in this episode is that it is very hard to distinguish your own set of pieces from the other player's pieces. All of the pieces in the game have the exact same shape, so if you're completely blind or have very limited vision, there's no tactile way of knowing which pieces are yours and which pieces are someone else's. And even if you do have some vision, if you are colorblind or partially colorblind like myself, or just have a hard time seeing such small objects, figuring out which pieces are which is really hard, if not impossible. This is something that I really struggle with in many games, and there are some workarounds for this without the manufacturer making any changes themselves, which my family and I do with most of the games that we get, and that is to find other random objects lying around the house that you can use in place of the regular game pieces. So, for example, with Sorry, one person could use a set of the regular game pieces, someone else could use 4 pennies, someone else could use 4 Monopoly houses, or someone else could use bottle caps. I mean, there's just random things that are lying around your house. It's easier when you're playing a game that each person only has 1 piece, but even in a game like this, where you have 4 each, there are still things that you can use to distinguish one piece from another. However, some things that could be done in the process of manufacturing Sorry is to make each set of pieces a different shape. This is basically the same thing as having to find random things around your home to use as pieces that are different shapes. But this would be better than using random things because sometimes it's hard to find 4 of the same thing from around your house to use as game pieces. And not only that, you need 4 sets of 4 different things. Or at the very least, 3 sets of 4 different things. An example of the manufacturer creating each set of pieces as a different shape would be Monopoly. Monopoly, while you only have 1 piece that you move around the board per player, they do have different shaped pieces for each player, which makes it easier to figure out which piece is yours and which piece is someone else. And it doesn't even need to be anything super complex. You could have a set of 4 pieces shaped like how they are now. You could have a set of 4 pyramid-shaped pieces, or a set of 4 cube-shaped pieces, or a set of 4 heart-shaped pieces, or different things like that. Not anything crazy, but just different pieces that are distinguishable for someone that can't see the pieces at all. Another option that could be done while keeping the same shape that they are now is to make them different textures. So you would keep all of the pieces the same shape that they are now, and have one set be smooth, one set be bumpy, one set be soft, one set have raised lines, just different ways to basically modify the pieces that are already created and just create different textures for them rather than having to design different shapes for each person's set of pieces. Another thing that could be done that would be helpful specifically for someone that has low vision would be to make the pieces high contrast. This would be harder because you have 4 different players' pieces and would need to make sure that each set of 4 is high contrast compared to the other sets of pieces. But having high contrast pieces would make them more visually distinguishable for someone that has good enough vision to at least see the different pieces. So to kind of recap what we discussed in this episode, some things that the game does well accessibility-wise are that the numbers on each of the cards are very large, and that the start and home positions are also very large and easier to find. Some things that could be improved with the accessibility of the game is that while the numbers and start and home positions are all very large, for someone that is completely blind or has very little vision, they still wouldn't be able to tell what number they drew or where the start and home positions are. So in order to remedy this, the numbers would need to be brailled, and braille markers for the start and home positions would also need to be added, as well as tactile lines around the start and home positions so that the players could tell exactly where their start and home positions started and ended. The card explanations are too small, so a large print in braille or electronic cheat sheet would be a great remedy. The spaces are too small and hard to distinguish from one another, so remedies for this would be bolder lines around each square, tactile lines around each square, as well as making the squares larger. The pieces are easy to knock over, so adding Velcro to each square as well as the bottom of each piece would reduce the risk of knocking things over and would also make finding each space easier for someone that is completely blind. And it is hard to distinguish which pieces are yours versus another player's. So making the pieces different shapes or textures, as well as making them high contrast, could help with telling one person's pieces from another. So would I recommend Sorry to blind or visually impaired people? Out of the box, I would say if you have some vision, then yes, I would recommend Sorry to you, because with magnification combined with the things that the game does right, such as the large numbers and the large start and home positions, then sure, you should be able to play the game without too much frustration. However, if your vision is worse or you don't have any vision, then out of the box, I would say no, I don't recommend Sorry, because the board itself is completely inaccessible to someone that has no vision and is either completely or minimally accessible to someone that has some vision. However, if you have a sighted person that can modify the game for you, then absolutely, I highly recommend playing Sorry, even if you are blind or visually impaired, because as long as they are proficient enough in Braille to create labels for you, or know someone who can, the modifications are actually not too hard. While putting Velcro on every single square and piece, as well as using puff paint on all of the lines on the game board would be time consuming, I wouldn't imagine that the modification process would be difficult. My mom actually modified our family's copy of Sorry a long time ago, so whenever I use that version, I can play it completely independently. Which means that if I'm playing with other blind or visually impaired people, we don't need a sighted person there to help us play the game because it's modified. So if you have someone that can help with that, then I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and while I have played it since I was a little kid, it is still something that I enjoy playing. I don't play it too often because there are other games, one of which I will be covering in the next episode, that I prefer playing more. But it's a good classic that I enjoy playing every once in a while. So if you haven't played it before, or you played it as a kid and then lost your vision and haven't been able to play it since, I highly recommend giving it a go with any of the necessary modifications mentioned in this episode. In the next episode, I will be covering my new favorite tabletop game, which is called New Phone Who Dis, and I am so excited to cover it. So make sure that you follow the podcast wherever you're listening right now, but also follow me on social media. You will not only get updates on new podcast episodes, but you will also get information on episodes that I am currently working on that I may not have announced here, and also to receive updates such as new videos I've posted on my YouTube channel or when I'm live streaming on Twitch, as well as other random tidbits of information that I just decide to share with the world. If you are blind or visually impaired and there is a tabletop game, video game, or mobile game, or even any kind of gaming related technology that you would like me to discuss in a future episode, or if you are a game developer and you would like me to test and review your game for accessibility, then feel free to email me at accessibilityandgaming@gmail.com, or you can let me know through my social media. You can find me on many social media platforms such as YouTube, Twitch, Hover, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with the name The Blind Gamer, TheBlindGaymer, or you can find my main social media accounts, which are on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok under my name, Shelby Farley, which is ChelbyFarley, where I post content about life as a disabled, queer, mentally ill person, as well as even more random tidbits of information that you may or may not care to know. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Accessibility and Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Shelby Farley, aka The Blind Gamer.